Born in Hungary in 1843, David Tzvi Hofman was a significant figure in the field of critical rabbinic studies. As a critical scholar, he was very much a part of his 19th century zeitgeist, occupying himself with lower and higher criticism of the biblical and rabbinical text. He divided the Mishnah into layers, responded to the documentary hypothesis, and also, and this is the topic of our paper today, he recognized the importance of later medieval sources for the reconstruction of earlier lost midrashim, in our case, the lost Mechilta Deuteronomy. The Mechilta is one of the legal midrashim, the early Tanaitic midrashim on the book of Deuteronomy. It was redacted in the beginning of the 3rd century and produced by the school of Rabbi Ishmael. Legal midrashim of the Tanaitic period were produced by two schools of thought, that of Rabbi Ishmael and that of Rabbi Akiva. The latter is considered the larger and more influential one. Theoretically, these two Tanaitic schools of thought produced midrashim on all 4 books of the Chumash, excluding Genesis, though the production of an Ishmaelian midrash on the book of Leviticus is still in question. However, not all of these midrashim were preserved through the centuries. The lost midrashim included the Mechiltah de Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai for the book of Exodus, the Sifrei Zuta for the book of Numbers, both from the school of Rabbi Akiva, and the midrash under discussion here, the Mechiltah for Deuteronomy from the school of Rabbi Ishmael. Scholars recognize their loss through quotes in medieval commentaries of rabbinic texts and through fragments found in the 19th century discoveries of the Cairo Gniza. This work is not over yet. Even as late as the 21st century, new discoveries contribute to our knowledge of this lost world. For example, in 2002, Menachem Kahana discovered and published an entirely new midrash, previously unknown from the writing of an 11th century Karaite Jew, Yoshua ben Yehuda, on the book of Deuteronomy from the school of Rabbi Akiva, the Sifrei Zuta Deuteronomy. Another tool for the reconstruction of the lost midrashim is the Cairo Gniza. However, although we have many Gniza fragments containing texts of legal midrashim in general, only a few fragments have been found regarding Mechiltah Deuteronomy. These were published by scholars such as Solomon Schechter and Menachem Kahana. Alongside these tools for the reconstruction of the lost midrashim, David Tzvi Hofman was one of the first scholars to recognize the 13th century Yemenite midrash, Midrash HaGadol, written by Rabbi David of Aden, as a major source for the lost rabbinic corpora. The aforementioned Cairo Gniza fragments facilitated confirmation that Midrash HaGadol had indeed incorporated section of the Mechiltah Deuteronomy. Hofman went on to publish his Midrash Tanaim out of Tanaitic-like paragraphs from Midrash HaGadol on the book of Deuteronomy and from a few Gniza fragments available to him. This was part of a huge project of these 19th century scholars that shaped our modern conception of rabbinic literature and paved the way to the new world of critical study of these texts. Hofman, and no exaggeration here, was one of the giants of this generation, and we owe much to his prolific creation in the field of philology, interpretation, and even biblical theology. However, Hofman's Midrash Tanaim poses problems that he himself was aware of. First and foremost, since Midrash HaGadol often incorporates sections from the Sifrei, the extant legal midrash on the book of Deuteronomy from the school of Rabbi Akiva, side by side with Mechiltah passages, Hofman used different font sizes to distinguish between the two. He wanted to collect only Tanaitic-looking passages, but signaled to his readers that some passages were not Mechiltah, but rather the known midrash on Deuteronomy from the school of Rabbi Akiva. It would seem, theoretically, that the passages in Midrash Tanaim that do not have clear parallels in the Sifrei Deuteronomy are to be recognized as the lost Mechiltah, and that these passages may form the basis for reconstructing the lost Midrash. However, major 20th century philologists have already called attention to potential problems in the material found in Midrash HaGadol. First, after comparing Gniza fragments of Mechiltah Deuteronomy, chapters 11 and 12 Midrash HaGadol, Epstein noted that some passages found in the original Mechiltah did not make it into Midrash HaGadol. So it is evident from this that we cannot rely on Midrash HaGadol as a complete source for the lost Mechiltah, but only as a partial witness. Secondly, a new problem emerged when our modern reading habits changed. When the Bar-Ilan Responsa database incorporated Hofman's Midrash Tanaim into its database, it did not preserve the different font sizes in his text, and instead digitized the entire volume as one straight running text. In other words, the new 20th century groundbreaking technology of the search engine, invented here by Bar-Ilan's own Professor Yaakov Shveka, in this case, actually set us back in time and flattened the achievement of Hofman by conflating the Sifri passages back into the text. A third and more complicated problem that stems from using Midrash Gadol, and as a result is from using Hofman's Midrash Tanaim, is that the material that appeared to be unparalleled in Tanaitic might in fact be a result of a later editorial alterations. In keeping with one of the characteristics of Midrashic anthologies, the author of Midrash Gadol tends to insert material into the text from other rabbinic and medieval sources. These changes range from partial quotes to alteration in the name of the speakers, textual changes within Tanaitic statement, and combination of material from multiple sources into one single statement. The resulting passages often seem Tanaitic and unparalleled, when in fact they are not. Therefore, the Hofman edition of Midrash Tanaim is a problematic source for scholars. In academic scholarship, passages from Midrash Tanaim are sometimes cited based on the assumption that they are authentic Mechilta passages, when in fact they are not. And in most cases, however, careful scholars simply ignore the Midrash Tanaim, afraid to misuse its content. This situation, while understandable, is regrettable. It must be emphasized, however, that the changes implemented by the author of Midrash Gadol, Rabbi David Adani, rarely affect the content of the Tanaitic passages themselves. This may be demonstrated by comparing those Gnizah fragments of the Mechiltah to Midrash Gadol, or by systematically delineating the method which Rabbi David Adani used in other places. As I have demonstrated in my master thesis, the combination of those two methods serves to prove Rabbi David Adani overall loyalty to the core of his underlying sources. So the Mechiltah is worth looking into. It's there, we just need to have access to it. So what we propose to do here today is to recreate the lost 3rd century Midrash based on Rabbi David Adani 13th century Midrash, but using 21st century computational tools. We have published first results of this attempt in 2018, and we are now completing an edition of the entire Mechiltah based on these tools. We shall proceed now to describe our methodology and to give a few examples of the way we use the sources to recreate the lost Mechiltah.
So how will we distill the lost Mechiltah material from the voluminous Midrash Gadol? Our first step, as per Hofman's programmatic plan, is the elimination step, reviewing all of Midrash Gadol and removing the material which David Adin culled from other sources. And it's actually somewhat analogous to what Professor Kohler did this morning in distilling Hofman's lost material from the response of his interlocutor. In distinguishing what we're doing from what Hofman did, it's important to note, although Hofman's work is sometimes presented as a critical edition of the Mechiltah Deuteronomy, this is not actually the case. Rather, his goal was to highlight all of the non-Sifrei Tanaitic-looking material in the Midrash Gadol. That is, he took all of the concise Hebrew material with terminology that fit the Tanaitic genre, and then marked it up to show what is found already in the Sifrei and what is not. So more precisely, what he published was a critical edition of not Sifrei. Well, I'll show you an example here. Okay, so here's a piece from Hofman's work, and he brings the words of the Midrash Gadol, Ki goy avad etzot hema, for they are a nation without counsel, the verse in Deuteronomy from Ha'azinu, Rabbi Yehuda v'Rabbi Nechemia. So Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Nechemia see it two different ways. Rabbi Yehuda dorsha klapei Yisrael, Rabbi Nechemia dorsha klapei Haumot. They argue on whether the phrase goy avad etzot is referring to Israel or to the nations. Rabbi Yehuda dorsha Rabbi Yehuda dorsha klapei Yisrael, ki goy avad eitzot hema, amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, ibdu Yisrael eitzat tova shenitan lahem mehar Sinai. Rabbi Yehuda explains Ovad Eitzot is about Israel. And what did they lose? What's the Ovad? They lost the Torah that was given to them at Har Sinai. Now, notice, Hofmann put the words Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu in small letters here. So we have a long quote, and then all of a sudden, a couple of words in a smaller font. In a smaller font that so says God. These words he indicated with the smaller font because what Hofmann is telling us here is that these words are not in the Sifrei. In other words, this entire paragraph is found in the Sifrei, just as it is in the Midrash HaGadol, but the words so says God are not found in the Sifrei. Now, what does that mean for us? It's the words Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the word so says God clearly do not constitute an independent midrash. Right? The fact that they're not in the Sifrei doesn't mean they're in the Mechiltah. They were very likely added in as a margin note along the way, just to clarify what was going on. But for Hofmann, this is sufficient. He aims to show it is not in the Sifrei, and that's all he does. But this does not a Mechiltah Deuteronomy make. We can demonstrate that these words were added to the Sifrei by Rabbi David Ha'adani, as he does in other places as well. And thus, these words will not be included in our edition of the Mechiltah Deuteronomy, where we intend to distill precisely what can be seen as Mechiltah, and not just words of Midrash HaGadol that happen not to be in the Sifrei. As a side point, and sort of harking back to what Professor Kohler talked about this morning about the polemics, this very passage that I brought, Ki Goy Ovad Eitzot Hema, this very passage from the Sifrei is cited by Raimundus Martini in his 13th century polemic, Pugio Fidei, for its interpretation of Goy Ovad Eitzot as a criticism of Israel. Raimundus wrote this work in the 13th century, the same period during which Rabbi David of Aden wrote his Midrash HaGadol. And we can imagine them sitting in parallel, each in his own study, poring over a manuscript of the Sifrei, and each using it for a different purpose. In Professor Kohler's talk this morning, Hofmann was working with the polemical stuff. In this case, Hofmann is doing a philological work, while Raimundus is using the same piece for a polemical piece. And note that Raimundus here quotes the passage without the Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The words so says God are not in there. So clearly his Sifrei also did not have these words. If it had, he certainly would not have missed the opportunity to include them. Now, the extent to which Hofmann was able to successfully execute this elimination strategy is astounding, given that he was working without modern concordances or computerized databases. We aim to embrace Hofmann's strategy, but to take it a step further using a computerized algorithm to search all against all. What does that mean? Well, computerized databases generally perform searches in response to a specific query of the user. The database returns results for the user's input string. When we are performing an elimination strategy, though, as per Hofmann, every passage needs to be searched. It's not a matter of opening Proyect Tashut and searching for one phrase or another phrase, but rather we want to know everything that has a parallel. So we want to search every passage in every configuration. It would not be reasonable to expect a human researcher to manually type in every possible input passage from a million-word text such as the Midrash HaGadol. So instead, this is what an all-against-all algorithm is designed to do. It automatically runs all possible queries from taking every passage in the text and searches the entirety of the rabbinic corpus for each one all at once. Instead of requiring the user to decide which input strings to search for, the algorithm considers all possible search strings and determines automatically which ones are significant. Now, let's take it one step further. If we were looking for exact matches, this would still be a fairly trivial task from a computational standpoint. But in our case, we don't expect the quotes to match letter for letter. Let's examine a typical example of how Rabbi David of Aden quotes the Sifrei in the Midrash HaGadol. So here we have a piece on top in the Midrash HaGadol, and on the bottom the corresponding Sifrei. Note that on top, note on top we have Haksherim v'Talmidei Chachamim, and on the bottom the equivalent phrase She'achasidim v'Haksherim, but completely different search strings, are on top Kashe Ketanin, and on the bottom Ketaninim. On the top Harashim, on the bottom Sheharishonim. And more. I didn't point out every single one here, but as you can see, about half the words in the text don't actually match up. So what this needs is an algorithm that can identify matches as identical, even if they only match approximately. And colloquially, we call this a fuzzy matching algorithm. The problem is that traditional fuzzy matching algorithms are computationally intensive and would require hundreds of years to process all of Midrash HaGadol, searching each passage against the rest of the known corpus of rabbinic literature. So this is where our new algorithm comes into the picture. Working with our research group at DICTA, the Israel Center for Text Analysis, founded by Professor Moshe Koppel, we developed an algorithm capable of performing this all-against-all fuzzy matching analysis in a matter of minutes. Applying this algorithm to the Midrash HaGadol very quickly identifies text passages reused from the Babylonian Talmud, the Rambam, and other places, which Hofmann often mistakenly included in his edition as Mechilta material. Now, before concluding this section of the lecture, I want to correct a possible misimpression of the newspaper article that Ephraim very sweetly held up before. When our project was covered in the press, the article noted that this search algorithm was designed specifically for this project. But really, the scope of the algorithm is not limited to this project alone. In this sense, our presentation here extends far beyond Hofmann and the specific case of Mechilta Deuteronomy. Rather, we might say that Hofmann's elimination strategy inspired a new algorithm which can serve as the basis for innovative research in many areas throughout Jewish studies, beyond the scope of Hofmann's specific research. And here I turn to you and say, please feel free to let us know after the session if our algorithm can help any of you with any of your current research projects, and we would be very happy to collaborate. Incidentally, although we have not yet received any queries about applying the algorithm to other projects, we did receive a bunch of queries this week following the newspaper article about asking from various scholars, asking about specific passages in Hofmann's book and whether they could be considered mechilta or not, according to our research. And we were thrilled with the questions, and we happily answered each one of them. But oddly, all of these questions, I have to note while I have the chance, before I give the microphone back to Michal, that oddly, all of these questions, with the exception of one, were addressed to me, to my email, and not to Michal. And here I wonder, do they not realize that Michal is really the mastermind behind the Mechilta part of our operation? Or perhaps, could there be a gender bias? Michal, what do you think?
Okay, so I want to turn to another specific example where the algorithm matches identified a match that Hofmann missed. And this is Avi? Oh, it moves with my hand. Okay. So this is, by the way, Hofman, the problem with Hofman's edition is a second problem with his edition is that it was published in kuntrasim, in different parts. So what happens is he switches what the font size means. In some parts, the big letters are the Mechiltah passages, and in some parts, the smaller letters are. So actually, I've seen articles of scholars who got this wrong because they didn't know that at the end there's an index of how you should read each page in the edition. So if you've been here and you hear this talk, you'll be safe from this mistake. But in any case, here it changes as opposed to the previous example we saw. Here actually, what he considered the Mechiltah is in big letters as opposed to what we saw before. So now, look at this drasha, right? So before, this is the sifrei because it's in small letters. And this one is in big letters, so it's supposedly unparalleled in the sifrei, right? So it could be a Mechiltah. There isn't even, sometimes Hofman gives us a parallel source that we could look at and consider whether it's a parallel to content. Here, not even that. And he just puts it in big letters, and it looks Tanaitic, right? Like there's a דיבור המתחיל, ופרסו השמלה, לשון כבוד, מלמד שנושאים ונותנים בסתרי הדבר. This is it looks Tanaitic, right? It even has a terminology that fits with legal midrashim. But our algorithm matched it with an exact quote from the Rambam, right? So this is obviously a Rambam quote that Hofman missed, put this in, and this is not Tanaitic. Now, interestingly enough, notice that the terminology that Midrash Gadol used here, Rabbi David Adoni, is melamed, which actually appears much more frequently in Midrashim of Rabbi Akiva. So even if we were to consider this as a Mechiltah, it doesn't work so well. We would expect in Rabbi Ishmael, Magid, rather than Melamed. So it actually, sometimes you see those statistics of terminology used in Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Ishmael. So if you take the supposedly Mechiltah passages in Midrash Gadol, this would skew your results because you would find terminology, midrashic terminology, what looks like midrashic terminology, when in fact this is a 13th century Rabbi David Adoni's addition to Rambam, so not Mechiltah. So this is a good example for our algorithm finding out a Rambam rather than an actual midrashic drasha. Now, this is a question that we got, which was a good question to demonstrate, to show the problem of using Pרויקט. So when you look at Pרויקט, because they took away the different fonts, see, here we're in a case where the smaller font is the sifrei and the bigger font is supposedly Mechiltah or non-sifrei. So when you look at Prouיקט, they're all the same size, right? So we got a question asking about those three first drashot combined. Is this Mechiltah or not? So when you open Hofman, the question would not have been that. Someone was working off Midrash Tanaim in a Prouיקט. If he would have opened Hofman, he would have known that at least the first one is definitely not. But even if you look at that, this is another good example to show the problematic nature of Hofman's edition. So first of all, he puts this in smaller letter to signal this is sifrei. In fact, it's not. Sifrei is only beit din shel gerim, but again, the sifrei doesn't have lotzi, it has pratle, because pratle would have named, by the way, Rabbi Akiva's terminology, and Rabbi David Adoni switched it for lehotzi. And also, Ad Shiyu Aviv Imam Yisrael is not found in the Sifrei, even though Hofman put it in small letters. So he made some mistakes like that. So it's difficult to rely on this. Our algorithm found that out. So we were able to locate that. But look at the second drasha, which Hofman actually puts in bigger letter. He was right for the first half, because Lama Ne'emar Lefi Shu Omer, that's an Ishmaelian phrase. The entire drasha is not found elsewhere. We would signal that as our algorithm did not find exact or fuzzy matches to this one. We would actually signal that as a Mechiltah. So this is a reconstruction of the Mechiltah. But the rest of it, the Mikan Amru, from here on, this, by the way, this section, Hofman already realized that this is Rambam, so he puts it in parentheses. But the Mikan Amru has parallels in the Tosefta, in the Mishnah, and in the Gemara. So this is a complicated case where we would have to debate whether this is a Mechiltah or not. We actually decided to put it in small letter because it's doubtful. But in any case, see, we have here partly Sifrei, partly Rambam, Rambam for sure, Mechilta, and we have parallels in other places, and our algorithm figured all this out. So again, this is the result that we have. How much longer do we have? How much longer? Can I give another example? Do you want to see another example?
I think
We're done?
well,
One more example?
yeah, quickly.
One more example. Le'akol. Okay. So one more example. So this is actually a nice example where our algorithm went beyond what it was supposed to do. So our algorithm signals a parallel here, right? And it said to us that there is a parallel between here, מדרש הגדול that talks about what are you supposed to do, טובע בנהר או חיה גורתו, ליסטים באים עליו, שחייב להצילו, and it signaled that it fuzzily matches the Rambam here. As you can see, that there's a difference in the word order, etc. But it also signals when we ran, so we ran it against the Rambam, we ran it against the Bavli, we ran it against the Sifrei, obviously, we ran it against the Yerushalmi. But when we ran it against the Bavli, we noticed that actually the Bavli is an exact match. So the Midrash HaGadol is actually quoting here the Bavli, which is an exact match. But it figured out that it's also very similar to the Rambam. So in fact, we found out through the algorithm that the Bavli is in fact the Rambam source. So now we can even, Rambam doesn't tell us his sources, and we have a lot of mefarshim over the year that figure out what the Rambam sources were, but our algorithm figured that out too. So imagine what we could do with the Rambam as well in other sources by using the algorithm to figure out their sources as well. So in this case, our algorithm figured out that this was Bavli, when in fact it signaled the Rambam as well. I'm going to stop here. I just want to show you that Hofmann figured out, so he signals to us that there's a parallel in the Sanhedrin, which is, he did, again, with his immense knowledge of rabbinic sources. Okay, concluding remarks. In conclusion, thanks to the use of this new and exciting algorithm, we are able to access a rare resource which presents us with the window into the theology and halachic worldview of the Ishmaelian school of thought, as expressed by its interpretation of the book of Deuteronomy. It's there, we can have access to it, and we can actually be certain of it now better using those tools. We are building on ancient writers, such as Rabbi David Adani, who had the Midrash in front of him, as well as early modern giants, such as Hofmann, who gave us the textual and methodological foundations. And with the use of artificial intelligence and computational linguistics, combined with human philological insight, we are now able to take Hofmann's work and finally restore the lost 3rd century legal midrash from the school of Rabbi Ishmael back to the Aron HaSfarim HaYehudi, to the bookshelf of rabbinic texts. Thank you.
Where you found switches in the terminology that you use, do you incorporate that into a sort of synonym or alias database where you'll see it again in other places? In other words, we know exactly where David is likely to use these sort of switches, and therefore we're able to identify it as
this is a very good question. So the question is, so we often get asked the question, for example, if I find a match between the Midrash HaGadol and the Rambam, how do I not know that what I found is in fact the source for the Rambam, right? Is the Rambam quoting the Mechiltã? The reason I can say fairly surely that it's not is because of those switches. If we look, every example, if we look across the board on David Adani's work, so Midrash HaGadol is for all the Chumash, right? So he did this in other places where I have the sources and I can see how he reworked his sources. And I can actually pinpoint on how he does it. So he likes, for example, to switch and put Prat Le in many places. He likes to change into Melamed. He switches the word order. I have patterns, and I can describe, I did this in my master thesis. We're not going to do this with the Mechiltã edition. It's just based on this work, and we're just going to present the bottom line. But it's based on the fact that we now recognize his methods of work. We know how Rabbi David Adani worked, and this is why we feel fairly certain that this is his changes and not that. So we can pinpoint that what helps actually, and actually reinforce from a different angle, the division that the scholars did in the 19th century between those two schools of thought. They said, listen, They say magid, they say melamed. Because Rabbi David Adani often switches those and mixes up and screws with our statistic, it's kind of easy. I read this and I say, this is wrong. This is Rabbi David Adani switching it, and it often is the case, and we can prove it because the way he worked across the board. It's a good question.
עוד שאלות? כן, טובה.
Okay, רציתי לדעת, I wanted to know, so how percentage-wise, how far was Rabbi David Tzvi Hofman? From what your
numbers is your
כמה קרוב?
how close was he? What you ended up
It
with?
was, yeah. The numbers will be out soon. We don't have the numbers yet.
50, 70, 90.
Average.
So Epstein already said that he has about 50% rights out of his Mechiltah cells. We actually think it's smaller than that. You can't. The problem is it's very hard to give you an answer because, as you could see, there is small words. So do we count the words? Do we count the drashot? How do we figure this? Like, right? But there's a lot of stuff that he signals. It's not the same. It's different, but it's not a self-independent, drasha. So do we include this in what he says? It's not a sifrei. Is that actually a mechiltah? It's not. He didn't intend it to it. So how do you count, right? So Epstein said 50%. We think it's lower than that.
Could I just follow up with that? Did you think of looking how poskim or dashanim or Jewish thinkers used the Mechiltah later using the algorithm and seeing whether they assumed Hofman to be authoritative or rather the other versions, or does this real theological implications to your whole project?
So the problem is with Hofman is that he himself knew that what he created was problematic, right? So we should write. I'm taking your question in two different ways. So we have the Rishonim who knew the Mechiltah and sometimes quoted, so they used it and they knew the Mechiltah as a Mechiltah. From the 19th century on, when Tanaim came out and was published, we actually see two different kinds of people. Those who work with the Midrash Tanaim, and very often it's a problem because they're working off Rambam or they're working off Bavli, right? And they're not really working off the Mechiltah. But critical scholars just ignore it. So Azan Yadin, for example, comes out with two different books about theology or midrashic ways in scripture as logos, right? He talks about Rabbi Ishmael's school. The only books he looks at is Mechiltah, the Shmot, and Sifrei B'Bamidbar. And he says, I'm not dealing with the Deuteronomy, the Mechiltah Deuteronomy, because we don't have a text for it. So the entire theology on the biblical verses of Deuteronomy is not there, is not treated in scholarship because we don't have the text. And we should be using this text. These are 3rd century's idea, theology of, left to us to the generation, and we should be using it. We should be looking at it. And it's a richness of sources, and thanks to computer worlds made possible by Avi, we can actually access it.
But, I don't know if your question was focused on scholars or like the yeshiva world, but if you look at the Roshei Yeshiva over the years, more than once Rosh Yeshiva has given a triumphant drasha where a Rambam has no source at all, and the Rosh Yeshiva will show the Rambam does not match the Gemara and does not match the Yerushalmi, and then the poyenta at the end will be but it matches the Midrash Tanaim to Dvorim. And the Rosh Yeshiva will pull out Hofman's book and say, but
What yeshiva did you go to?
but sociologically, in terms of how it's impacted yeshiva learning, in the base medrash, putting Hofman's book is there, right on the shelf of the base medrash, and it's treated as completely as a Tanaitic work, and it's completely misunderstood then in the pilpulim that ensue.
שמי דוד צבי הופמן, אני מדבר עברית במחשב. אני מכל מקום רוצה לשאול, מדוע עד היום לא תורגם עבודת הדוקטורט של דוברים זצ"ל לעברית?
שאלה מצוינת. אני בעד. ממש בעד. צריך למצוא לזה מימון ולעשות את זה.
קריינה דהיגרת.
אז אני, אם הייתי שולט בגרמנית 100%, אני מבין ויכול לדבר, אבל לקרוא קשה לי מאוד.
אני בעד.
לא מסתדר.
נתחיל בהקדמה של הופמן למדרש. נתחיל בהקדמה של הופמן.
אז תפעלו שהדבר הזה יתורגם לעברית.
נתחיל בהקדמה של הופמן למדרש תנאים, שהיא עדיין בגרמנית במהדורה שבפנינו. בוא נתחיל בה. זאת אומרת שהוא אומר מה שהוא עושה, שזה נורא נורא חשוב. בהחלט. מאוד מאוד חשוב. מסכימה לגמרי.
אוקיי.